The history of Lakeville begins long before Lakeville as we knew it even existed. Millions of years ago, glaciers were forming the land into the town we recognize today.
We're talking about three things. We're talking about geology, we're talking about climate, and then we're talking about the culture and the culture impact. And so on those basic issues, the geology starts way back when the continents banged together. And this part of New England is very unique because it once used to be a separate strip of land, a continent out in the middle of the ocean, banged into North America, then two of them banged into Africa. And the result was you have an underlying ripple structure that's not very deep, but it's a kind of a wave structure. Maybe from top to bottom, depending on what it might run from 50 feet to 250 feet, depending on where you are in the situation. But it runs north-south in this area, and it stops about the Connecticut-Rhode Island line, where the junction point was. And all those things bear into the place and how it is and how it's set up. In southern New England, up to just below Boston, those waves are basically almost north and south. And as you get up toward Boston, they curve around. And the Merrimack River comes down from New Hampshire, bangs into that, and that's why it goes east and west. But what it does, it sets up the underlying river flow. South and southern part, the rivers tend to run north and south in those hollows, except where the glacier, impacted them.
To start out actually way back, we could take a quick peek at the geological origins of the town, which simply means there was a ice age, and it was a lengthy age, and the glacier that covered Middleborough was, according to the experts, at least a mile deep. And what it did is it would move forward, and then it would recede, and when it did, it would be raising and lowering the water levels of the lakes and the rivers if they were to be seen. And then the ice would take up soil and rocks and kind of dump them or drop them in different locations. And two of the major formations that we're aware of are pudding stones. They're scientifically, I guess, called conglomerates. But the pudding stones, of which there is one still behind the YMCA, here in Middleborough, the erratic rock boulders that would be dropped, somebody couldn't have moved that, it was way too big, would have been dropped by the ice glaciers as well as they moved around. And we're told that Barden Hill is a gravel moraine where the glacier dumped its till. Now, as far as Lakeville, the glacier lake Assawamsett, said to have been drained of its water level, causing the white soil at the bottom to be exposed, heavy winds taking that white soil and creating what we today know as the White Banks.
Well, about 12,000 years ago, we believe the glaciers receded. And then after that is when the water started and the land did all this uprising and the ponds developed. And see, the ponds were like one of the most important parts of this whole area, the Great Ponds Complex. We have Lake Assawamsett, which is the largest natural body of water in the state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And it's been a migratory flyway area for birds going north and south, and it's also been herring coming up to spawn in Assawamsett. And also it's because, depending on the sea level, you would either go towards Mattapoisett and the bay, or you would go towards Mount Hope Bay down the Mascot River in that direction. So people were traveling, using the portaging when they needed to, but basically using the rivers for transportation.
When the glaciers moved in, they scoured that out, and then as they retreated, filled it back up. So even though the natural river flow was north and south, right here in about the middle, from the Taunton River all the way to Providence, all those rivers come north and south, then stop, go east or west, till they found a way through the glacial moraine, and then they go north and south again. So everything south of here basically runs north and south, and that's the way Assawamsett Pond is set up.
After the glaciers receded, the first people to move in were Native Americans, who called the area Nemasket.
One of the best sites was along Assawamsett, and that was known as Wampanoag. And Another site was at Titicut, which is closer to the Bridgewater line. And people from Robbins right now are working at the Little League site, which is on the Nemasket River in Middleboro, and they're unearthing things there. Tools, things that the natives used, and that's how we learn about the natives.
We know that the population was here approximately 10,000 years ago, and sometimes it was them traveling for food source, and other times to trade, but they lived in and about this area. And there's been archaeological digs done on the other side of Assawamsett in Middleboro, and the native population was there then, and they had permanent dwellings. And they can determine that because of post-hole digs that they did. The remains of the archaeological digs show where post holes were, and they can tell by the circumference, the size of the long house or ritus, and because of that, they can also tell from the trash pits that they dig up what the people were doing, if they were making tools, if it was something that had to do with a seasonal, or if they were there permanently. We do know that behind the library on the Sargasso Sea, which was named by the Boy Scout Council, there was a summer encampment there, probably small, someone who was making tools, but also probably doing some fishing and things like that. So you have to think about the water levels have been higher and they've been lowered. Now that Assawamsett is dammed because it's a water supply, there's more water that pushes back into the land than when it would have drained naturally on its own. So there would have been more shoreline.
One very big dig that was done, I believe it was in the 1950s onward, was at Lakeside, Lake Assawamsett, where they uncovered a large village and were able to recover lots of stone artifacts and also the post molds, which would tell the shape of their dwellings. The woodland Indians in this particular area had basically 3 villages. Assawamsett at Betty's Neck was a place of one, Titicut in North Middleboro, and then Nemasket, which would be at the Muddock, and that is really where Oliver Mill Park is located today. Through up to, it's not just one little point, up through maybe even into the Pratt Farm, certainly.
See, natives settled in this area, 8 to 12,000 years ago. That the natives used the riverways as highways. They lived along the Nemasket River, they lived along the riverways, and they used them for fishing, they used them for food, they used a lot of the reeds to build their houses, living quarters really, not houses, but the riverways were extraordinarily important to them. We have to remember that the Cape Cod Canal didn't exist, so that if they wanted to go to Boston, they had to go all the way around Cape Cod to up to the Boston Harbor. They couldn't just go through that neck. Or they had to portage. They could portage their canoes over the neck. But there were waterways that went from Scituate, and it's called the Wampanoag Canoe Trail, that goes all the way down to Mount Hope. And then there were waterways that came from Buzzards Bay that went up through Lake Assawamsett, Nemasket River. They connected with the Taunton River, up through Bridgewater. And it just was fascinating to me that they could really travel quite a way.
In the lower end here, where the rivers run out, you have beautiful agricultural land. It's also where the fish runs are. And so climate, of course, affected when the fish runs occur and all the rest of those things. And you're thinking about 1,000 years ago, is just about in the middle of what was called the medieval warm period in Europe. And it lasted from about 900 to about 1300. And that's the time of the rise of agriculture in New England, in southern New England. That general native agriculture expanded, and the corn production and that whole culture expanded, and the population expanded.
Once they arrived in the New World, however, the Pilgrims realized their problems were far from behind them.
When the English came here, they were affected by that little ice age, which caused all the turbulence, Henry said, I'm Pope of England, 1500s, okay? The southwestern, the Calvinist religion took place down in southwestern England. And finally, just prior to the time of the migration starting, the separatists, they got their rights to have their own religion, essentially. The Pilgrims were a group that were farther to the right, let's say, on that, and they, as a commune, got together, lived in Holland for 20 years, but because of the English-Holland War disturbances, they had to get out of there. They came back to England on a boat, never got off the boat, added a few more people to get enough to pay for the voyage, and headed out here.
When the boats come over here, before the Pilgrims, this is into the 1500s, they'd come over, and according to this, as an I am in the book, they'd go down and they'd put the fish, the cod, in the hold, and then they'd go up onto Cape Cod and they'd get sassafras bark off the trees and load that on the top, because sassafras was considered to be medicinal. And they took that back, and sometimes the sassafras bark was worth more than the fish was.
Prior to the English coming, the Pilgrims coming, only a few years before, in 1600, 1618, the native population, which was like isolated, all the Americas were isolated. They had a completely different immune system capability than Europe. Europe had about 37 of the antigens, and here you only had about 15, 16, 17. So in that mid-16, 17, 18, a whole series of those diseases which they had not had immunity for hit the whole eastern seaboard here from Maine down through, and mostly eastern Narragansett Bay. Didn't get the inland. It was where the contact was with the fishermen, who also had been brought here because of the Little Ice Age. Europe was in trouble. They found the source. They were fishing. The Basques gradually worked their way through, ran into the herring runs, the fish runs on the East Coast, worked their way down. The word got back to Europe. And so now from the 1500s, you get ships coming over here in mass, fishing. They brought the disease vectors with them. When it hit, it wiped out the population in this whole area from the Maine coast down.
Previous to the Pilgrims arriving, there was an epidemic that killed off many of the natives.
They had a terrible time the first winter. It was one of the coldest periods in that Little Ice Age. They lost almost half their people in the winter. A Native American, I guess I believe it was Sassaman, who'd been taken on board a ship, taken to Spain, was in Spain for a while, got himself someone in the fishing, got himself to England, learned the English language, got on a boat, came back across, got off of it, and went to go to home, and home is not there anymore, and here's Plymouth. So he knew, he had lived there, he knew the English language, he knew the native languages, and he's the one that brought them the capability to, how to plant, taught them how to plant and do corn, and that corn, maize, squash matrix.
It was Squanto who arranged the first meeting with Massasoit, and the Poconokeets and the Pilgrims made a treaty in which they agreed that neither would do harm to the other, and both sides would aid the other if attacked. And this whole idea is called reciprocity. And that was, as I say, was very, very important, and it held up until Massasoit's death, nearly 40 years.
Massasoit is what we used to call a particular individual of Native American heritage, but his name was actually Assamequin. He had two sons, Wamsutta, whose English name was Alexander, and Metacom. His English name was Philip.
Massasoit, who was the person whom they made the treaty with, he was concerned about invasion of Narragansetts from the west, and he was also concerned from the Abenakis.
At first, the natives and the colonists got along. The natives tried to teach the Pilgrims survival skills and how to work the new land.
The natives were very, very important to the Pilgrims If it hadn't been for the natives, the Pilgrims wouldn't have survived. They wouldn't have made it through that first winter. The natives would teach the Pilgrims about fishing and where good fishing spots were and how to use the fish. They used the fish for planting to enrich the crops. They used the fish for eating. A lot of the fish, bones of the fish would be used for tools, so that the natives believed in using every single bit of an animal that was caught, or that gave its life literally for the natives.
1629, when the first group of Puritans came into Boston, Plymouth fed them. So they had a very well surviving society in that particular situation. But in the meantime, you know, relations on a whole with the natives were, you know, Mets are Mets, probably there, but not like they were in the first contact when he was talking about how great things were.
It'll be about the 1650s when the first settler comes to Nemasket, as it was then called. Grown children and grandchildren of the Pilgrims. It was getting a little crowded in Plymouth, Patuxet, as it was originally called, and they needed to move out into other areas for their farmlands. So they began to live in Nemasket along with the natives, and this would continue until 1669. That Nemasket itself would be still considered part of Plymouth. And when it was incorporated, it was called Middlebury. Somewhere in the 1670s, maybe, I believe, the name kind of changed to Middleboro.
Middleboro and Lakeville actually were part of Plymouth for at least the first 50 years, up until 1669, when Middleboro became its own town. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. And obviously people who came over on the Mayflower and and their offspring settled in Middleboro.
At Plymouth, it got to a point where they were able to expand. The population had grown, they had more settlers there, and they started moving this way. So they came to what was Middlebury, and it was halfway between Plymouth and someplace else, which I don't remember now. And what happened was they started having what they call the Indian purchases, where the land was divided. 16 shilling is a very famous one, and is most of Lakeville, but there are other purchases. And what happened was that they would trade with the Wampanoags, and they would purchase the land.
Now, land purchases from the Indians in 1661, the first purchase of land came from the Indians began with these 26 men's purchase. Other land purchases will take place over the years, and in 1675, a huge purchase of land will be bought, and it'll be called the 16 shilling purchase, which will eventually become Lakeville. Most all of that purchase will become Lakeville.
There were families who came over on the Mayflower, and Francis Coombs was one. The Nelsons were one of the first families to settle here in Lakeville, along with the Pierces, and the Pierces were very, very important to both Middleboro and to Lakeville. They were very generous, worked very hard.
As I said, 1669, Middlebury will be incorporated, and what that simply means is, according to law, the town must take care of widows and orphans. They had to have and maintain a community church. They needed to provide an education for children, and they needed to train and equip a militia. And they also had to repair the roads that radiated out in all different directions from the center, which was the Green, as it was called, that area near the First Congregational Church.
In the very early days, there weren't wagons. Women and children would ride on what's called a pillion that was set up behind the saddle of the gentleman, and they would go to church that way, or would walk. It just was a life that I don't think any of us can really conceive of. It was very difficult.
Once a year in March, they were to hold a town meeting and they elect their officials and conduct their business. And what was kind of interesting is that everyone had to attend. Failure to do so, you were fined 2 shillings and 6 pence, which is obviously European, the English type of currency. Wouldn't that be wonderful today if the townspeople could fine people if they didn't attend the town meeting?
A store did not exist until 1745, which you think how we go out to the stores these days and go buy milk or go buy a lawnmower or go buy whatever. They couldn't do that. They couldn't buy clothing. They made all of their clothing. Children helped. There were young girls who did the knitting, spinning, weaving. They grew flax, they grew linen, and then those were made into fabrics. Sheep were shorn, that was made, and then it was carded, and then it was either woven or knitted. It also was dyed. They found pokeberry would be a red dye. They made their own toys. Very often a peddler would come from house to house, and a boy might buy a jackknife, or a girl might buy a needle. And it perhaps was not even bought. They perhaps would trade, because money wasn't terribly prevalent back then. They made their own candles. They made their own soap, and it was fascinating to me that soap was made out of ashes, liand ashes. For their own personal soap, they might add bayberries for a good scent.
This harmony sadly would not last. Eventually, the difference in cultures became too much between the natives and the Pilgrims.
It got to the point that the generations, the younger generation, was more interested in, rather than respecting the agreement, they were more interested in trade with other countries, in profit, in providing for themselves. And so the agreement with Massasoit was forgotten.
The clash of cultures was inevitable. There was a difference in the idea of how land was supposed to be used, clearing it, fencing it in. It changed the environment. And these people used the environment as their culture. That's how they existed.
The native population looked at the land as that they were more caretakers of it, where they all owned it, and so they had certain boundaries where certain tribes lived. But ownership, the sense of owning the land, wasn't the same as the English attitude about owning land, where you purchased it and then you could tell people not to come on it. Where the native population, there was a little more flexibility there, and the use of the land, and the whole religious part of it, the Great Spirit and all that sort of thing. So what ended up happening was that, of course, the native population needed more land to be able to support families and also livestock, and they needed an income from their crops and things like that. So they had a tendency to want more land, and the native population was sort of in the way.
It's said that this was going to be the beginning of the native people looking at the area as being lost. The forests were being cleared for farmlands and so forth. Pastures were being fenced in. Some concept and ideas that were not in their particular culture.
There were certainly attempts to smooth things over. Of note are the efforts of John Sassaman, who attempted to bridge the culture gap with disastrous results.
John Sassaman was considered a native, but he was also someone who had gone to Harvard, and so he was well educated. And he became an interpreter.
They took 4 young men, Indians, sent them to Harvard. One of them was John Sassaman, who ended up down here involved, married into Tiscopan's family in some way, shape, or form. So all these interrelations went by.
John Sassaman had set up land deeds so that his descendants and other family members would have the use of of land at Betty's Neck and along the shores of the pond. So very early on, our Lakeville Indians were able to stay here and live and have productive lives.
Tispequin, just prior to Philip's War, so was going on, he went out and got deeds in the Plymouth court for a 500-acre plot around Betty's Neck and another 100-acre parcel where that drumlin, that high point of land is just as you come into the neck. He deeded that piece to 3 of his relatives, son-in-law, I think maybe nephew, son-in-law, and John Sassaman, who was also a son-in-law of his.
John Sassaman, he was actually a Christianized Indian, and he was also King Philip's interpreter and secretary. And on January in 1675, he decides to quietly warn the people in Plymouth that Philip is preparing for war.
He was trying to smooth things over, I believe. He went to the governor to tell them that, that King Philip was planning to overthrow, but he didn't want him to tell him. He wanted them to try to work it out, and then of course it didn't. And he ended up being murdered, and they found him in Lake Assawampset. He was frozen under the ice. It was cold. They ended up at first having a trial, but the trial was really it was slanted. It was slanted against King Philip.
They find his hat and coat, Sassaman's, on the ice in Sampson's Cove on Lake Assawampset, behind the Assawampset School. His body is found under the ice. He has been murdered. 3 natives are accused, tried, convicted, and executed for his death.
John Sassaman, as many people know, was allegedly murdered in Assawampset Pond in 1675. 3 Indians were convicted of the crime, and they were executed.
This tension would eventually culminate in King Philip's War, when a series of events in the 1670s destroyed the relationship between the Wampanoags and the colonists for good.
The King Philip's War, Alexander, who after Massasoit's death, Alexander was the older son, and he became the head of the main Sassaman of the tribe. And they knew that something was going on because people were giving people in Plymouth and the Middleboro area information that there was discontent. The natives weren't happy with the attitude of the settlers and things like that. So what ended up happening was Alexander was called to Plymouth, and he died there under questionable circumstances. The native population felt that he had been poisoned. I don't know that there's ever any proof of that, but it was just enough to stop so that his younger brother became Sachem Philip, and he was very angry about the whole thing, and they ended up what the people called King Philip's War developed.
The start of the war ended up that King Philip was sure that his brother had been poisoned. Whether or not he was or not, he died. It could have been heat. In the previous summer, it could have been heat. It could have been he became ill, and they carried him from Marshfield to Mount Hope, where he died. And they blamed the governor at that point for all of that.
The Indians had sold off almost all the land they had and some of the most sacred sites that they had. And this was probably the last most sacred area to the Wampanoag Indians, this whole town. It has lots of history, and there's probably lots of Indian artifacts buried underneath the ground.
The very beginning of it took place when an English boy fired at a native, and the native died. The fact that the native had been killed was impetus for the natives to attack. And they did. In Swansea, June 24th, 1675 was a day of horror. Natives ambushed settlers from behind bushes, killing at least 10. Gershom Cobb, who was a Middleborough resident who was visiting Swansea, was killed. and that was the official start of the war.
Another incident in June of 1675. We call it the Hand Rock Incident. It took place near the fort in Middlebury. The residents were concerned with what was happening, the feelings between the two different cultures. So they took shelter in the fort, and the natives across the river were at Hand Rock making inappropriate gestures and insults. And the commander of the fort at the time, John Thompson, decided that he needed to do something to scare the Indians. So he decided that they were going to shoot the long gun. The long gun was indeed long. It was 7 feet, 4.5 inches long. He chose Isaac Howland because he was a very good marksman. And when they fired the long gun, it had to rest on somebody else's shoulder. And when Howland shot the weapon, he hit an Indian and he was mortally wounded and died. Seeking revenge, the native people went to Samuel Barrows's gristmill, which was just downriver from the fort. Barrows saw them coming, put his coat and hat on a stick, so we're told, and ran through the alders that were along the path to the fort, and he managed to get into the fort safely. His coat, however, had some shots in it. The residents of Middlebury stayed in the fort for a while, and then they fled the fort to Plymouth for safety. Their homes were burned, the town was completely destroyed, and so were all of the town records, which is part of the reason it makes it so difficult to know exactly what went on before King Philip's War.
King Philip actually left this area and went west and ended up coming back. Whole towns were destroyed. Lakeville was burned, Middleboro was burned. Many people died.
Middleboro was devastated, it was burned out. Rehoboth, Swansea, those towns that were close to where Massasoit and Philip had been, were really attacked. The lower ends of those, where the people lived down at the lower ends, where the agriculture stuff, they had the farms and easy access. Not very much happened in North Rehoboth. They went in and attacked the settlement areas. But Taunton had very little effect. And one of the things that happened in Taunton was there was a major iron works, the Leonard Iron Works in East Taunton, fairly close to Titicut. The guy that ran that had good relations with the natives, had them working for him, gave him the same pay as anybody else he hired. He actually had a couple of them work their way into positions of supervision. So when the conflict took place, they had an excellent relation with Sassaman. And so there were a couple of effects on the outskirts of Taunton, but the Taunton area essentially came scot-free from King Philip's War.
Benjamin Church was a gentleman who led a company of soldiers, and the natives there were natives who worked with him, and natives taught them to spread out his men, and so that they wouldn't be as easy to attack. And you never went into a swamp the same way you came out, or you never came out the same way you went in, which I thought was fascinating, that they were teaching him native tactics.
The war dragged on through the fall and winter, with the natives destroying towns across New England. The tides turned in the spring, however, and the colonists gained a significant advantage with the help of Benjamin Church.
Someone betrayed Philip, and they ended up killing him. He was killed, and his head was brought back to Plymouth and put on a pike and outside the gates and everything. And his family was sold into slavery, they believed, down in the Caribbean. And pretty much, unless you were a praying Indian, which was someone who had adopted the Christian faith, you pretty much were sold out of the area. So at that point in time, the native population really stopped existing in this area.
It ended in Rehoboth with the capture of Anawan, who basically just gave up and said, "You got me." And both Tispequin and Anawan, when they were taken to Plymouth, they lost their heads, and their families were taken and sent as slaves to the most probably to the Indies.
Percentage-wise, it was probably the worst that it fought in the United States. Because of an estimated native population of 20,000, at least 2,000 were killed or died of injuries. 3,000 died of sickness or starvation, and 1,000 were sold as slaves and sent to the Caribbean and other parts of the world. Then another 2,000 traveled west to join the Iroquois, or north to join the Abenaki. And from then on, natives really were not significant in New England, because King Philip's War had just more or less disbanded them all.
The end of King Philip's War ushered in a new age to Colonial Middleboro, one of growth, prosperity, and major change.
The first family to move into Lakeville probably was the Richmond family, and they probably crossed over from Taunton about 1703, 1700. Following them came the Leonards, and early on, about within that time frame, the Nelsons came. The Nelson family was probably the most prominent family in town. They were merchants and involved in town government throughout the Middleboro's history.
Another interesting individual from Middleboro will be Reverend Isaac Backus. He is going to separate from the Congregational Church, which was the religion of the early 1700s, and create and begin a Baptist church in North Middleboro. He will also encourage new members and new groups, and there will become a Second Baptist church that will meet in the Nelson House in Assawamsett with the itinerary preacher Elder Hines as their minister about the 1750s. And then there will be 2 years later another group in the Beechwood section of Lakeville that will follow the Baptist religion. Now that's important because there was a tax collected to support the church, but not Baptist church, the Congregational church. And for the rest of his years, Backus will encourage by letters and talks and so forth that should not be required of everyone, especially if you were a different religion. And eventually, that will be changed, that the Massachusetts Constitution and even in the National Bill of Rights, that will not be a requirement.
They probably were politically astute, and they, or usually if you were influential, you were active in the church, or one of the churches. The Nelsons were Baptists at that point, and the center of Lakeville at that time was the Upper Four Corners in Middleboro after the Church of Green, when people left the Church of the Green area and kind of moved down into the Upper Four Corners of Middleboro, near where the town hall is now, and Central Congregational Church. That sort of was the Upper Four Corners. And Lakeville had Four Corners at Vaughan Street and Clear Pond Road and Main Street, those intersection there. And there was probably more industry and development in that area for a while too. But Lakeville never really had an industrial downtown because they were part of Middleboro until 1853. And that was when a lot of towns were separating from the larger communities because they wanted self-government and they wanted to be heard. So it was a tendency at that time for people to do that.
Initially, the center of Middleboro was at the Church of the Green. And that was actually logical if you think about it, because Plymouth Street ran from the town of Plymouth over to Taunton, but the First Church and Sproat Tavern were right there by the Church of the Green. And the Pierces were very instrumental about moving the center. Moving the center from Church of the Green to where it currently exists.
Another individual who actually their family will start in what was to be called Lakeville. They will live on a farm on Main Street near Stetson Street. And this is a man called Job Pierce. He cultivated over 200 acres of crops, mainly corn. He and his wife had 3 children before they bought their farmhouse on Main Street in Lakeville, and they will have 4 more sons. Their oldest daughter will marry a gentleman named Peter Hoar, H-O-A-R, and when the mother of these children of Job Pierce passed away, this oldest sister will raise one of the youngest children, Peter H. Pierce, in their home on Main Street, also in Lakeville. Their house, the H-O-A-R house, is still standing today on Main Street in Lakeville.
Like most other colonies, Middleborough colonists were discontent with rule under the English king. However, Middleborough also had its share of dissenters. Some of its most prominent residents were, in fact, Tories.
Parliament was very unhappy with Boston because of the Boston Tea Party. And they actually punished the people of Boston by passing the Intolerable Acts, which meant that they actually closed the port of Boston until they paid for the tea. They had to pay for the tea, and of course the people wouldn't. And people from Middleborough, women from Middleborough agreed to not wear any imported clothing, or they made their own linsey woolsey. They continued to make them the way they had early on.
There are other individuals. Before Oliver actually left, he had a son, Peter Oliver Jr. Peter Oliver Jr. married the governor's daughter. Thomas Hutchinson, at the time, was governor. His daughter Sally married young Peter, and their wedding reception was held at Oliver Hall in Middleborough. Can you imagine the hoopla if a governor's daughter came to, just for a visit in Middleborough, never mind a wedding reception. But anyway, all of the special people were invited to the reception, and Father built a house in 1762 across the street from his mill complex, and he will give that to his son and his new daughter-in-law.
Judge Oliver got a factory going. He was one of the first people to get a factory going right on the Nemasket River in Middleborough. And in fact, it's Oliver Mill, right on Route 44.
Oliver, on the other hand, because of his position, he was going to be a judge, and he would advance from one judgeship to another till he was holding the second highest position in the colonial government. And he will first be involved in an incident after the Boston Massacre. We're all familiar with the shooting between the British soldiers and the snowballs or rocks being thrown by the other individuals, the residents in Boston. Well, there were 8 British soldiers who were put on trial, and that took place in November of 1770.
John Adams and Josiah Quincy defended all of the British soldiers. They didn't defend the Americans, they defended the British soldiers.
And Oliver will be one of the judges on that trial. And his good friend, a patriot friend, John Adams, will defend the soldiers during that trial. And 2 of the soldiers will be found guilty. The rest will be found innocent.
He loved America, but he also felt that that the king was the king, and he was very respectful of him. Zachariah Eddy is another very important person to Middleborough. He asked Judge Oliver if the king had done the right thing. Judge Oliver answered, "As to that I cannot say, but he has the power." And so loyalists all over the colonies were banished, and the two who were banished from Middleborough were Judge Oliver and his son, Dr. Peter Oliver.
Judge Oliver, again, as I said, was considered a Tory. He will leave Middleborough about 1776 and head back to England on a ship with some other individuals who are also loyal to the crown. His house will be confiscated by the government, and unfortunately in 1778, when the revolution wasn't going quite as well as the Patriots thought, they will go to his mansion in Middleborough, and Oliver Hall, as his mansion was called, will be ransacked and then burned to the ground.
They had a beautiful, beautiful mansion right on the Nemasket River in Middleborough, and their house was actually burned for being Tories. So yes, they had to leave.
The Lakeville area also produced its share of heroes. Deborah Sampson is one notable, if unconventional, patriot.
Another individual of importance during the American Revolution will be Deborah Sampson. Although she was born in Plimpton, Massachusetts, when she was about 10 years old, she's going to spend her childhood living with other families. She'll live first with a relative, Miss Fuller, then she will live with a widow, Reverend Peter Thatcher of Middleborough, for about 2 years, and then from the age of 10 to about 18, she's going to live with the Thomas family and their 10 sons. Maybe that's what influenced her a little. Besides hearing about the revolutionary ideas and so forth, because she was a very good spinner of thread. And she would go to people's houses, and she also spun at the Sprout Tavern. She would disguise herself as a male and enlist in the Continental Army.
Deborah Sampson was a woman. She actually was one of the best spinners who came from Middleborough, and she really felt very strongly about wanting to fight in the war, so she disguised herself as Robert Shirtliff. And to go to enlist, she didn't dare be recognized. And so in disguise, she went to Bellingham, which is quite a way away. And she enlisted with 50 men in May of 1782. And then she marched with a company to West Point. And she fought in many, many battles.
She'll be wounded 2 times, but it won't be until she catches a fever while in Philadelphia when she will be discovered and given an honorable discharge in November of 1783.
She did get sick, and she did run a fever, and that was when the doctor discovered that she was a woman. And at that point, she was honorably discharged and came back to Middleborough.
There was a Tory farmer called Samuel Doggett, and he was jailed in New Bedford for voicing his belief that it was wrong to rebel against the crown. So this is an example of one of the people who took a different stand.
There were Minutemen. 70 Minutemen were waiting for the British in Lexington on the morning of April 19th, 1775, and Colonel John Parker knew that his men were very, very outnumbered. The British went to Concord. They put guns and ammunition, had already been taken away, so they were moved. Major Pitkin was he was the British major, and he was very frustrated. The Minutemen saw smoke, and they thought that the British were burning Concord. So the British sent soldiers to Colonel James Barrett's farm, where guns were supposed to be hidden. Those had been moved also. And Colonel Barrett and his men watched the British from a nearby hill. They saw the smoke, and they decided to attack the British. The Americans hid behind rock walls, trees, anything they could. They fired on the British. And when it was over, 273 British soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. But the Colonials had only lost 95 Minutemen, and that was the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Middleborough citizens, they were unhappy with the British. Patriotic feeling in Middleborough was high. Caleb Bryant, riding over fences and fields, brought the news of the Battle of Lexington. A number of Middleborough men took up weapons and set out to fight. And a company was formed by combining 4 companies of regular militia with Nathaniel Wood.
Captain Job Pierce led a company of Middleborough men in the Revolutionary War, and Major Peter Hoare was a member of the Massachusetts militia that was at Lexington in that first encounter.
The grandson of Thomas Nelson was John Nelson, and he did fight in the Revolutionary War. He was a colonel in the Revolutionary War.
After the Revolution, Middleborough and West Middleborough began to prosper and grow through the end of the 18th and into the 19th century.
Back to Peter H. Pierce, he will become a very prominent individual in Middleborough, and many, many people still are familiar with his name. Colonel Peter H. Pierce got his rank in the War of 1812. He will marry a woman named Abigail Nabby Sprout, and most people always called her Nabby and never really did know what her first name was. But Nabby will, along with her husband Peter, raise 10 children in their homestead on North Main Street. It is the Deacus Murray Deacus Law Office today. He was a very wealthy individual, earning his money through real estate He had a store, which today is our local police station, and he owned mill houses all along Jackson Street, of which the Middleborough Historical Museum owns 2. The rest were torn down, and he owned a mill at the bottom of the river, a shovel works. When his final heir, Thomas S. Pierce, passed away in 1901, he left $500,000 to the town of Middleborough to be used for whatever the town budget couldn't afford. He also left $50,000 to build a public library and $50,000 with the interest to be spent for books and magazines. The library was built on the Pierce family squash lot. They did have a garden, and that's where the library is located today.
Up in North Lakeville, we have Tack Factory Pond. Throughout southeastern New England, there was a very prominent family called the Leonard family, descendants of James Leonard, who was up in Saugus and was at the earliest ironworks called Hammersmith Farm. From there, he moved down to Taunton and established a ironworks in Rainham. One of his sons, Thomas, and it passed on through Elkanor and to others, had a forge at what we call Tack Factory Pond in North Lakeville. And for about 150 years, the iron industry was a very prominent industry in Lakeville. We had forges and bloomery devices that produced iron. We mined iron out of the bogs. We got iron ore out of Assawamsett Pond. It was a very important industry around here, and most people aren't aware that right now there's some people trying to make walking trails from one ironworks site to the next.
The tack factory, there were straw works. People would actually braid straw, and then they would be made into hats later on. There was a lot of home-based industries besides farming and agriculture. They did raise flax, and there's a couple of streams where we know that they actually beat the flax because you have to get rid of the woody outer bark, like the stem of this flax, in order to get to the fibers. There were home cobblers before the shoe industry in Middleborough developed much later. And so there was a lot of home-based industry that was going on. And we also had at Assawamsett Pond, we had a lot of pond ore was being dug up. Most of Assawamsett is not a really deep pond, but the actual place, which is across from Parkhurst, the Nelsons actually had some kind of flat-bottom boats that went out with a big scoop, and they scooped up the iron ore that was in the bottom of the pond, and then that would go then to a place to be turned into bar iron and made into nails and things like that. So that was sort of a 3 or 4 step type of process of small industry in the area.
Another important industry was the straw hat industry, and this started in Lakeville with an Ebenezer Briggs. He resided on the south shore of Lake Assawamsett. In about 1828, he commenced making bonnets. The straw factory was very successful until 1895, when the owner, at that time, Arthur R. Alden, will die, and the business will not be reestablished. And people will not be wearing straw hats that much anymore. They'll be moving on to a different style.
It's hard to believe that seals swam up the Nemasket River, and of course the cod, and then the herring were very, very important, and the nets that were made from reeds and from hemp.
Another important industry in the area would have been the herring. Strange as it may sound, the spring migration of herring from Mount Hope Bay in Rhode Island up the Taunton River into the Nemasket River to Lake Assawamsett to other ponds was required because that's where these fish went to spawn. Their herring migration has always governed any changes that were considered on the Nemasket River. It's even written into some of the deeds of the property that you must keep the fishway open so that the herring can migrate each spring. In the Muddock community, where Oliver Mill Park is located, there would have been a smokehouse where they would take the herring and smoke them to preserve them, and they would give them to eligible residents who could not afford to purchase them, like widows and others who just couldn't afford it. Children were paid 1 cent a stick for putting a dozen herring on the stick so they could be put in the smokehouse to be smoked. Now, the town raised revenue for the privilege of catching and selling the herring, and it would be decided at the town meeting. It would be put up for bid at auction, and this was usually held in February or March because the herring came a little bit later in the spring. And since part of the river in the spawning grounds are in Lakeville, Lakeville has always received a share of the revenue based on, it says, rateable polls compared to Middleboro's rateable polls. And of course, none of that takes place today. Today, we just have fun watching the fish and catching them where they are allowed to be caught